And we're live. Welcome to Earful of Dirt Lineouts. And I've got Mark Bullock with me, the director of rugby for the Glendale Raptors. How's it going, Mark?
Hey, it's going well, Aaron. Thanks for having me on board.
Yeah, it's great chatting with you about 2 weeks ago and setting this up. Can't wait to see what Glendale puts out on the field and to see what the things that you guys have done just in the last 6 months. And when we saw the Merlins, we did, I think, 2 match companions for you guys. Because you guys broadcasted. So in the guise of the Joe Rogan match companions for UFC when he's not calling the fights, we decided to do some commentary of our own, and those tended to be well received. It was amazing to see the difference between what the Merlins D1 side looked like versus you put together a schedule of some of the best teams in club rugby, and it was, pretty intense to see.
Yeah, we were really interested in trying to play the best competition that we can, just because that helps us to get better, and hopefully it's good for our opponents also.
So, getting into the interview, let's set up your background a little bit. So, you played. You were an NCAA football player for your freshman year in college at the University of Montana, but then you transferred to Stanford and then picked up rugby. How did that happen?
Well, I played football at Montana, and academically, it wasn't quite the challenge that I had anticipated. And in any case, I decided I was going to transfer, and I thought I'd go to UC Davis, UC Berkeley, and I had a friend said, "Hey, why don't you go to Stanford? Why don't you apply there?" So I did, and I got accepted, and then of course once I got accepted, I thought, well, how am I paying for this? And then I figured out, well, I got accepted, I'll figure it out. So I ended up going to Stanford. I didn't actually play rugby at Stanford. I started playing after I graduated. I became a teacher as a football coach at Calaveras High School in Northern California, and one of the teacher's husband played rugby for Davis City Rugby Club. His name was Bill Eckern, and he now lives in San Jose, but he said, "Hey, why don't you come out and play rugby?" So I was like, "Sounds great. What is it?" And he explained it. And of course, at that time, it was the time of leather rugby balls and so forth. And I went to a training in Davis, which was about an 80-minute drive from my house. And I enjoyed it. It was quite fun. And then actually our first tournament was the Stanford Tennis-side tournament. And I didn't know much about the game other than tackle the person with the ball. And of course, I'm short, so he said you'd be a scrum half. So I knew I was supposed to pass the ball to number 10. And that was my introduction to the game. And I fell in love with it. And obviously, I've been involved since 1975 with rugby.
Awesome. So when did you stop playing? Did you transition to being a player coach, or did you just become a rugby coach? And then specifically, what made you become a rugby coach? And then we've also talked about how you are also a Canadian Level 3 certified coach. What pushed all of that?
Well, let's see. So I was in Northern California, applied to graduate school at the University of Washington, and moved to Seattle. And when I got to Seattle, I was interested in playing rugby. So there's no internet. So I looked in the newspaper, Seattle Times. There was a little ad for the Seattle Rugby Club. I called them up. It was in the fall. And I said, "Hey, I play rugby. I'd like to join a team." A guy on the other end said, "Well," he goes, "we've got a game this weekend. What position do you play?" I go, "I'm a scrum half." And they're like, Great. Love to have you come down." So they said, we'll have a guy meet you down in the parking lot at South Center. He'll be in a brown van. Why don't you meet him there on Saturday at 9 o'clock? So I'm like, okay, where's South Center? So I drove down there. I'm in this big parking lot. It's raining, of course. And this brown van kind of pulls around. And so I get out of my car and I go over and knock on the door and said, "Hey, are you Ralph Burba?" And he's like, "Yeah." And I said, "I'm Mark Bullock." And I hopped in the car. We drove down to Tacoma, played the Tacoma Tsunamis. I played scrum half, and that's how I joined a rugby team in Seattle and got involved. So while I was playing with Seattle, I was a high school football coach and a high school basketball coach. I was at Liberty High School at that time in the state because I'd stopped my graduate work. And so as I was doing that, I thought, well, why don't we have a high school rugby program that leads into and funnels players in the Seattle Rugby Club? At the time, Tony Smith was the 10 for Seattle, and I was a 9. And of course, if you know Tony, he likes to talk a lot. So we talked a lot about rugby and decided that we should be involved with high school rugby. So I started a program at Liberty High School, which I was also the football coach at. And he got involved with Overlake High School and then Redmond High School. So we basically started 2 different programs. And that's how we got involved and how I got involved coaching rugby. It was primarily a need or a vision to see we needed high school rugby for our view was to develop players who could then transition into a men's rugby program. So that was kind of the start of it. And Rick Raffs and I coached at Liberty High School, which is still an ongoing program up there and successful. And then in 1990, our football staff, we transferred to Kentwood High School. We previously just won the state football championship. So we went to Kentwood High School. And while at Kentwood High School, we started another program there. We also started the first actual high school girls rugby program. So that was kind of how I got involved with the coaching. The certification, when we first started coaching, this was in 1985, 86. We really didn't have any certification program that I was aware of. We were just close to the Canadian border. We played the Canadian teams, both with Seattle Rugby Club and with our high school teams. So it was just easy and convenient to go to Vancouver and get certified with level 1, 2, and 3 Canadian certification. So that was the start of my certification. And actually, the coaches that we had were, Bob Dreyer from Australia was one of the lead coaches there, and then Laurie Maines was one of the lead coaches. And actually, he ended up staying with us or with Tony during that time. So we got a really good introduction to some high quality coaches. It was really valuable for us.
Awesome. So you've been a coach of multiple sports, football, basketball, rugby, of course. And so what kind of athlete doesn't start playing rugby right away best transfers into rugby?
Actually, it's an interesting question. I thought about that, is that across the board, the best athlete that transferred in is really somebody who's got an open mindset about changing sports. And then being open, wanting to learn and wanting to get better. Now, if we were to look at, from my perspective, because everybody has a different perspective of which athletes should make the best transition, I think wrestlers make a good transition. They may not have the hand-eye coordination of passing and catching, but they've got the contact and the physicality and the hand grips and so forth. So they're pretty solid about that, and they understand the difficulties in overcoming adversity from being a wrestler, because you can't always be on top when you're wrestling. The next group that I think makes a good transition are basketball players and hockey players. Now, why basketball and hockey? It's because both are involved in contact, different kind of contact, but they're involved in contact. They both play games that have quick transition from attack to defense. So they have to go from I'm in an attack mode to I'm in a defensive mode. and they both operate under the assumption of trying to get a 2-on-1 or a 1-on-1, and then trying to beat their man 1-on-1. Those are the essence of playing rugby. Those are kind of the key ones that I found on the men's side of the game. On the women's side of the game, what I found was gymnastics, girls gymnastics. Those players make a good transition into rugby, at least from the high school standpoint that we'd coached at. So, yeah.
Yeah. I knew some gymnasts growing up and that were at high levels, and it was amazing to see how they transferred over into different sports, when they stopped, whether it was track or, I guess water polo was one of them. And it was like, huh? Like and then you talk to them, it's like, well, I know you don't run that much. He's like, well, I just ran the mile, under 6 minutes. I was like, what? Like way faster, like way fast. And the girls are like, something about gymnastics just keeps you in crazy shape, and they can just do all sorts of stuff.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
So we've talked about like the kinds of athletes that transfer. What is your view of bringing in crossover athletes to rugby at a high level? So we're going to be talking about Major League Rugby later on in the interview and your role there. And so what is your view on crossover athletes, say, pushing what it takes to push them all the way to the national team? Because I look at our national team and you see the two largest groups out there are foreign-born players and crossovers. And a lot of people have different views on crossover athletes. I, myself, am a former football player. And I had no background in rugby. And now, as an adult, I'm playing rugby. And I'm not a high-level athlete, so I can't I believe in the idea, but I also understand that there needs to be an environment to bring someone along, coach them, train them, so that they can play professionally and possibly try for the national team.
Yeah, we accept all crossover athletes, but your point, back when I first started playing rugby, kind of a common question of people that I knew would be, because they knew I played football, and it would be, well, what sport do you like best, rugby or football? And my response was always, they're different sports, and I like them both, and I like them for different reasons. And when you talk about crossover athletes, it comes back to, you were asking about which athletes make the best transition. And I think the key factor is, do they have an open mindset psychologically about participating in a new game? And the key factor is they have to be open to the fact that they don't have any knowledge about the game, and that they're going to make mistakes, and that the mistakes are okay, and they can't get frustrated by that. I mean, they may get frustrated, but they have to be open to this new experience and understand that the experience is going to take some time. So in Glendale, we've had a number of players that had come from NFL background, taxi squad kind of players, or arena football players. And I'm talking about offensive tackles who were, 6'6" and 300 pounds. And they had what I consider an open mindset about playing. And so first they lost weight. They learned the game. It took about a year to really get involved, but they adapted. One was a prop and one was a second row, and they both adapted quite well to playing the game. And one was having a look at by the U.S. national team at the time. We had a fairly damaged shoulder from his time at University of Colorado Boulder, and ultimately, stopped playing because of that. But I think that really the crossover athletes, they just have to have an open mindset and be willing to put in the work. You've obviously, as a coaching staff, you have to upskill them. You've got to spend a lot of time on what they're doing, and then the athlete themselves have to make a commitment. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's how I look at it. It's like, how committed is the athlete to become a high level like rugby athlete versus, compared to like, and what environment they were previously in. Because to an extent, I think we sort of lose in the club sphere, not in what you're about to launch this next year and what Glendale has established. Because like you said, you've brought in high level athletes from other sports and it's worked out fairly well. But in the amateur club sphere, for most of, I would say, our duration, is like, it's hard to stick when someone comes out of an NCAA program and they're used to a high level daily training environment, position coaches and strength training and meetings and breakdown of film and all sorts of that. And then they come into the club sphere and it's, practice 2 days a week, no film study. In some clubs, there's no playbook. You don't know what you're, to an extent, it's really hard to learn when you don't have the same resources available that you once had in the sport you came from.
I can't I can't agree more thoroughly on that. A perfect example. This is not even professional high level crossover athletes. This is when we coached high school, Liberty High School in Washington State. We'd have athletes that weren't part of our program, and we were fairly structured because I come from football background, and the athletes would come out of our program. They go to university. As an example, one young fella, he's now a rugby coach, John Johansson. He went to Washington State, and he calls me up and says, "Coach," he goes, "I don't know if I can play here." I go, "Why not?" He goes, "Well, we just had the start of the season meeting, and they spent all their time talking about kegs and where the keg was, and not about the game." And that, to me, is an example of someone coming from an organized program, be it high school or college, and then moving into a club situation that is not organized or that's coached by the players. And that's a real turnoff. And your point being, someone who's at the University of Colorado in a very structured professional setting of sports activity, or they're coming from an NFL situation or some other kind of situation, they come into a club where there's no weight training, there's none of the things that you just alluded to. That can be a real turnoff to those players. And so part of our job in Major League Rugby, if we're going to attract those athletes, is have, again, part of what we're doing is being professional. And professional is not just about paying players, it's about everything that we do. It's how we, as an organization, operate. And that operation is from stadium to marketing to coaching to our production. So we have to have that environment, and those athletes then are going to come in and go, "Hey, this is a legitimate professional organization and I want to be part of it." I might have pontificated too much there, but
so going back to how you got into this, you were high school principal in northern Colorado when Mayor Donovan recruited you to start the Glendale program. How did that work?
Well, it's kind of a long story. It's not just him coming to where I was being principal at Battle Mountain High School. It actually started in 1998. We took the U.S. under-19s to the World Cup in France, in Toulouse. After that, when we came back to the States, we were ready to start our new cycle in 1999. In 1999, one of the athletes who had come to one of our camps was Mike Donovan's stepson. And he got invited to our national camp, which was going to be held in Colorado Springs at the Air Force Academy. So apparently, not to my knowledge, I didn't know Mike Donovan from anybody. His stepson was just a player on our team. But apparently Mike told his son if he participated with our national camp and so forth and really dedicated himself to that, he would get back involved with rugby, because Mike had rugby experience in the British Virgin Islands when he was living down there. So Tyler Mintz, who was a player, he made the U.S. team. Mike Donovan got involved, and because I was coaching up in Denver, he got involved with the rugby club that I was coaching at that time. And as he got involved, I needed a manager. He was highly organized and well-spoken. And so I asked him to be the manager of the U.S. Under-19. So in the end of '99, he became the manager of the U.S. Under-19 and was involved with 3 world tours that we had and participating in another World Cup down in Chile. And so that was how he and I connected and how we became involved. And part of that involvement at that time with the U.S. Under-19, we really didn't have a lot of sponsorship from, and I wouldn't say support from USA Rugby financially. As an example, in '98, when we were World Cup there, the coaching staff purchased the warm-ups and a V-neck sweater for our players so we looked like a team, because there was no funding for that. Part of that no funding was the players that we got had to pay their own way. So one of the things that Mr. Donovan did is he set up a foundation to try to help support players who didn't have the funds to participate. So that was his initial involvement with it. When I became a principal, I stopped coaching the U.S. Under-19s, and Mr. Donovan went his way. And then in 2005, he had, and we had talked about some of this, but he convinced the city of Glendale that to rebrand the city, they needed to have something that was unique and set them apart. So he picked, and he chose rugby because he loves the values of rugby and everything that rugby stands for. And he thought that would be a great niche sport because we weren't going to get an NFL team because there's already the Broncos and all these other teams. So that was kind of his start of it. And when he started, he then contacted me because we had worked together both with the U.S. Under-19s and with the Denver Barbarians. And so that was the connection. So they came up and they said, would you like to build a program? So now the interesting thing at the time is I said, well, I have a really good job here. You'd have to pay me. And you'd have to pay me similar to what I'm being paid here. So they left, and I thought they'd never come back because it was rugby, because rugby's full of inertia. And they actually came back a week later, and they were like, well, yes, we think we've worked it out that we can be able to pay you and do the rugby. And I said, well, what's the deal? And their response was, well, we'd like you to be the recreation director, the fire marshal. We'd like you to be the facilities director, projects director, and we'd like you to write grants. Oh, yes, and be the Homeland Security liaison with the state of Colorado. And I said, and I get to do rugby? And they were, yes, you can. And I said, I'm in, thinking that was a pretty big risk because no one had ever done that before. And so in January 2005, I relocated to the Denver metro area, and we started to build a rugby stadium and develop a rugby program.
That's a great story. And it, you know, I'm guessing over time your other roles have reduced as, you know, this has grown.
Yes, they have, absolutely, because it was a bit crazy at first. And it was actually a great challenge, and I love challenges, which was part of the whole deal, is starting our rugby program and trying to get basically building a stadium and a park and a recreation center. But, you know, I had to learn about being a fire marshal and fire inspections and different kind of things. Some of the things were already part of what you did as a principal with facilities and projects and so forth. But some of the others were quite new. But as we've grown, and particularly as we're now in the Major League Rugby, those other assignments have been cleaved off to other people in the city.
So going back to the Under-19 program, you helped establish and lead that program for a period of 4 years. What was that like?
Well, the whole thing, it's an interesting deal. I talked about Tony Smith and when we both started school rugby. And during that time, Tony had been reading Rugby Magazine, New Zealand Rugby Magazine, and they had an all-star, kind of an all-star team that they picked from various clubs in New Zealand, and they had come to Vancouver and played, and then they usually go to England and played. And so in reading that, Tony's like, hey, we could do that. We could set up a U.S. development team under 19 based on that model. And so he and I had quite a bit of discussions about it and decided that we would go ahead with that. And then we were like, well, you know, we need another coach. We need somebody that's not from the West Coast. And the previous year, Liberty had played in the national championships in Utah, and we had played Xavier High School. And at that time, they had a really young coach named Mike Tolkien. And so I said, hey, why don't we get Mike Tolkien? He's pretty well known on the East Coast, and he's just starting out. And so let's get him involved. And so we basically ended up starting the under 19s, and we started as a development team. And we just really went to US Rugby and said, hey, would you give us permission to travel to New Zealand for 3 weeks and play a series of games? And it took a while, but we got that approved. And then we went to New Zealand. We played 9 games. We won 2. As coaches, we learned a massive amount of what we needed to do. And that was sort of the start of the under 19 program. And so I was involved with that for approximately 10 years, both as manager, coach, director of the program, et cetera. And so that program grew in 1998. And this was 92 when we traveled to New Zealand. So 91 was when we started the idea about it. In 98, USA Rugby contacted us, and that's when they really, what I'd say, officially took over. And then they wanted us to travel to France to play in a World Cup. And we're like, well, it's in March. We usually go in summer when our players are out of school, because most of our kids were high school players. And US Rugby was pretty insistent that we travel and play. So we traveled to France and had opportunity to play our first match against Ireland and Brian O'Driscoll, and that was an experience. And we actually played quite well. We got beat in the second half. Game was close at half. Second half they beat us, but it was a close game and a good experience, I think, for our staff and the players. And so that was the kind of the start of all that. It was a good adventure, and it was met some good people and a lot of good players.
So let's turn a little bit more to Raptors, Merlins, and the Raptors Rugby Academy. Taking a look at the literature of the program, you guys start at minis and go up to U20s.
Yeah, well, when we started, one of the driving forces of starting a rugby program back in 2005, and actually we started in 2006 with actual teams. One of our goals was always to have youth rugby involved and a development pathway, if you will, for youth rugby. And that would have been what we have now, is from under 6 up into the high school ranks. And that's how we started. And we have a director of youth rugby, Jenna Anderson, who does a great job. She got on board when we first started because of a grant that I wrote to develop youth rugby, and we were able to hire her, and she's been fantastic for us. And our program is pretty comprehensive in the academy of the young kids. We run after-school programs on Tuesdays and Thursdays in the fall and the spring. In the summer, we have a camp. About 1,500 kids come in from the YMCA. So we run a week-long camp. We have a girls' high school camp. We've had boys' high school camps, week-long camps during the summer. In the winter, we run a flag indoor rugby program. And then in the late spring, we run a contact tri-rugby, which is a competition here in Colorado. So it's fairly comprehensive. And one of the key factors for us is that our players are asked to coach and assist in that. So part of it is our mentoring to give back to the game. And so we have that opportunity to make those connections. And then this year, we've been looking at, actually for quite a long time, an under 20 program. The challenge has always been getting enough players, getting a mass of players that you can actually compete. And then who do you compete with? And so USA Rugby is directing their attention to kind of under 20 programs where kids who aren't going to college, how do we keep them in the game? And so we now have an opportunity to compete in the collegiate division in the Colorado, the Rocky Mountains area. So we decided we had the impetus to really get an under 20 program started. So we recruited, obviously in Colorado and nationally, and picked up some players and started our program this year, and it's far exceeded our expectations.
Yeah, you guys have. You guys are currently playing, was it D1A B sides in Colorado, right?
Yeah, well, when we started, and I'd have to say it's kind of like when we started, we didn't really know what kind of, we recruited players that we knew were pretty good athletes, but we really didn't know what kind of team we'd have because you're starting from scratch. You just don't know. So we felt, and then in conversations with Eric Geib at USA Rugby, that we should play B-side, university B-sides to start with, because that would be a good starting point for us. And that's what we did. And in our first game, we realized that, we were potentially pretty good. And actually that mirrors what happened when we started our men's program. And how we got our men's program is we had ads in the newspapers and said, we're having a tryout on such a day. Actually, it was August 4th. And we had about 25 players show up. Most all of them had played high school rugby or played some college rugby. And that's how we started. But we didn't know how good we'd be at that time. And we just had to play whoever we could play. And we played our first match against the Air Force Academy, and we won quite handily. And once again, we're like, oh, we could be pretty good, And so our under 20s kind of mirrored that. And so this spring, our schedule will be against D1A type teams. So we'll be playing some teams like St. Mary's and BYU and university colleges around here, so we can be challenged and so forth. So, yeah.
All right. So one of the questions I had to to ask about this was, what is the structure of the U20 program? Are players compensated, or are they paying to attend the academy? And then the other thing, I remember reading the press release, is that most of these players would be enrolling in community and local colleges in the Denver area. And then also, what is the practice schedule like for them?
Yeah, all really good questions. The under 20 pro, I would like to be able to compensate them, but no, the players actually, like members of our other teams, they pay dues. The players they pay dues. They're just part of our regular kind of rugby program. Obviously, they're amateurs, and they train. Right now, they train Monday and Wednesdays in the evenings. In addition to that, if they're not working or in class, they train in the morning. So they'll come in and do weight training with right after the professional team. And so there's a lot of interaction between the professionals and them. And then they will go out when the professional team goes out on Mondays to train outside. The under 20s will go out and train with them also. So it's not the full team, because again, it's players who have that time and are not engaged in employment or school. Then select players are invited to train with the professional team in the evening. So the professional team trains on Tuesday and Thursday evening. The reason they train in the evening, the professionals, is because we have the match fee players who are part-time players, if you will. And so some of our under 20s are training, obviously 4 days a week. They all train in the morning. If they don't train in the morning, we have a different weight session for them in the afternoon. So they get a pretty full schedule. And Your question about school and work. What we're working on is agreements with local universities and community colleges so that as the players come in, they have to either be gainfully employed or they have to be attending school. And so that's in fact what the players are doing. And we have a coordinator who looks after that. So, yeah.
Let's see. Next question here. And then we talked a little bit about some of the lessons learned from the fall, but what are some more lessons learned with the U20 program? From the fall season, and you've talked about some of the changes you'll make for the spring.
Well, I think one of the key things is that your under 20 program is really a development program. It's a pathway. So you have to look in terms of developing the athletes. And some of that is that you get some players that have come in and they're might be at the top of their game, but you get other players coming in that aren't. But if you work with them and you develop them, they can be, quality players and they can fill in. So for us, we've already had 3 of our players have played professionally. And because they played professionally, they played as match fee players. And so they've actually, some of them have been compensated for their playing time. And they would, of course, be at the lower end of the match fee pay schedule. But that's a real big opportunity for them. And it's a big push for the athletes, because the other ones who see that go, you know what, if I work hard, I can get to this point. So that's, I think, the biggest thing that for us is we have to look at it as a development program. The professional program is a little bit different in that they're obviously fully professional and their expectations are slightly different.
Got it. So a lot of people looked at your under 20 class as like pretty large. Whether you look at that and think that's a lot of players or not, that was some of the feedback we got. Do you guys intend to recruit just as large a class for next year?
Well, I think some of that's an interesting question is, will we recruit a large class? Obviously, we recruited a large class this year because we, didn't know how many people would come, because it's, they've got to make a decision if they're going to go to college or not, if they're going to play. And the big one is, are you willing to relocate to Colorado? And so those are all big decisions, and we didn't know how that would work out, and it's worked out pretty well. But like all things, you have hiccups and different things are going on, and it's Colorado or our program might not be for everybody. So some athletes will move on, or they might go back home because they're homesick. Just depends on what their situation is. For recruitment next year, I wouldn't say we're going to, well, how would I say this? We'll recruit a lot of players. The question is whether or not they'll all choose to come here to play. So in the recruitment of collegiate players for other athletic things, you have a big recruitment, but you don't always get all the people that you want. And so we'll recruit a lot of players. Whether or not they all come is another story. And part of it, development is making sure that you have enough players to play and so forth. And that gives us an opportunity to have a second side down the line. Then we have a second side and we can play B sides or other universities.
Nice. So we've talked a bit about the Raptors Rugby Academy. I've spoken with Thierry Dopont of Austin, and I've spoken with Matt Trouville of Houston. It looks like they're gonna get their academy up within like the next 6 months. Both are structured a little bit differently. I know the Seattle Saracens had announced a U20 program, but unlike Glendale, there hasn't been, from what I can tell, there hasn't been any movement on feeding that U20 program. And it's structured a little bit differently than yours also, but I haven't seen anything from there. But the real question is, sorry to be long-winded, when do you expect the other Major League Rugby teams to have a fully functional academy like you do now?
That's a good question. I don't know that I can have expectations for them. They have to have their own expectations. But Terry and I had conversations a year ago about under 20s and so forth. And at that time, of course, they were affiliated with the Huns. And so they were probably in a better position to get their under 20s going. And that may still operate, somehow through the Huns to them. But I know that they're highly interested in getting their under 20s going. Conversations with Seattle, because I'm a former Seattle Rugby Club player and still have connections there. They are working on their under 20s. The thing there is, of course, they've got kind of the Seattle Saracens, and then they've got the Seattle Seawolves. And so it's how they're going to connect the two of those. And I don't know how that's going to operate. But I know that they're highly interested. And we've had conversations with Flinney up there about under 20s. So from our standpoint down the line, what would be ideal is that if all of the major rugby teams had academy teams and we had the financial ability to play matches on the same days that we actually are playing matches with our professional senior sides. But that's something that's probably further down the line, just because, again, our first goal with Major League Rugby is to make it to the second year and keep our costs down and so forth. So that under 20 model is probably going to be a little bit different. And it may be that the under 20s in those areas, will play university sides until we get to a point where it's financially viable for us to have an under 20 competition within Major League Rugby. But that's down the line 3 or 4 years probably.
Got it. That sounds awesome. Really.
Sounds awesome. We just first we got to get through the professional, get to our second year, and the year after that. And then I think you have opportunities to look at how do you structure, and if you have the funding to structure an under 20 competition, which would be not unlike teams in the Premiership.
So you've put together a solid team with Dave Williams. How many players whom saw action with the Merlins will be putting on a Raptors training shirt in January?
All of them? Well, that's kind of a smart answer. In the fall, we basically, the team that was competed as the Merlins, they were basically all of the Raptor players that we had in the spring.
That's what I mean, I'll be honest. I sort of, I wouldn't say it was negative, but I called it lipstick on a pig at the time.
Yeah. And part of that had everything to do with the marketing, and that the Raptors were the professional team and that the Merlins were the amateur group of that. And because the Raptors are owned by an investment group, and they now own the Raptor name, if you will. So we really couldn't compete as the Raptors because that was their entity, not our entity, but we wanted to keep our players actively engaged and playing and competitive in the fall. And so in order to do that, we ended up with the Merlin Elite team. So we wanted to separate that from our Merlin D1 team or Merlin D2 team, which are, the quote, the non-Raptor players. But I mean, basically the team that competed this fall against Nyack and Old Blue and Ontario was the Raptor team. They just had the name Merlins. And so all of those players, and I wouldn't say all those players, but the vast majority of those players will be the Raptor team when we make that announcement. And some of those players, will play either up or down depending on where they are, because you've got the people that are kind of in between. And we actually have a lot of part-time or match fee players that are high quality players, but they've got successful careers where they make more money on their career than they would playing rugby in the United States right now as a professional.
See, so when it comes to those guys, do you have any signings that are upcoming, or is the roster pretty much set?
Our roster is fairly set. I would say it's 90% set. We have a couple of positions that we're looking at filling, and some of that is we have one of our players who had played with us and injured his shoulder, went back home to South Africa. He's been in the States for 2 years, went back home to have surgery. He actually right now is playing in Japan professionally, and he's looking to come back to play with us. So we have some players kind of in that realm where we've had discussions with them, and it's just whether or not they want to commit to playing with us.
Got it. When will you announce the Raptors for 2018?
What we'll do is as we get everybody's contracts in, that's when we'll announce them. We don't want to announce somebody who's not technically contracted. So our anticipation would be in December to January.
Got it. Because it was like we had this sort of happened. It was kind of weird. I talked about it on the show. Back in August, there was a players agency that did a press release. And I guess they had the contract, but it didn't get finished until, mid-November with New Orleans. So we were like, found the press release, posted it up. And this is before I had established our relationship with New Orleans. And it was like I was talking to the GM, Ryan Fitzgerald, and he was like, actually, that didn't happen. Like we just got that contract validated by the league 2 days ago.
Yeah. Well, see, I think part of that is that we can do a contract offer to the player, say from the club, but ultimately the contract is with the league, and so the league has to sign the contract. And so we want to get all of our ducks in a row before we make any announcements.
Awesome. So you and I previously talked about how Dave Williams was like the perfect hire when you transitioned from being both director of rugby and head coach to being just director of rugby. What made that so?
Well, first off, I think the big thing is that what people don't know is Dave has been with our organization since 2008. And so he actually played scrum half, some games with us, but mostly while he was associated with USA Rugby as their strength and conditioning coach, he worked with us as a skills coach. And anytime he wasn't on duty with USA Rugby, either with USA Rugby 15s or 7s, and he was back in Colorado, he worked with us and has worked with us. And then last year, he was involved with the previous professional league, and he did a tremendous amount of coaching and has done a lot of coaching. I don't think a lot of people understand that he's done a lot of coaching with US Rugby and skills and so forth. And so I had an opportunity to continue to observe him as I have through the years. And, he was ready to be a head coach. He had a lot of responsibility with the Denver Stampede. And obviously they had disbanded, and he had been working with USA Rugby, and Mitchell had removed him from their organization to get his own people in. And so I think it was a perfect opportunity for Dave to take over and utilize his skills as a head coach. So he's a young head coach, and he, I think, is doing a really great job. I thought he did a great job in the fall, and continues to grow as a coach. And in fact, his staff or his coaches and I are going to England on Friday to work on our coach development and upskilling with some of the teams there and the English national team. So he's a great addition as a head coach, and the players seem to be pretty enthused. So we're extremely happy.
So when it comes to the coaching staff, how is that shaping up? A question from the board that we run was Peter Borlase had previously been a part of the Raptors coaching staff. I know he's with the Denver Barbarians. Is he returning for the professional season?
Actually, Pete is looking. Actually, Pete's going to work with us, not full time, but he'll work with our scrum and so forth. Ciaran Browner, also known as Ted Browner, he's been with the Glendale program since we started, and in fact, I coached him even prior to the Glendale program. And he's a competent and very good coach. And actually, he works with Roundtree from England, who's the English coach, or was the English coach. And so Graham Roundtree. And so we're pretty pleased with that. But I think Pete is going to be, we've recommended that he offers services to some of the other clubs. And I believe he's going to do some work with Houston and perhaps, I'm not sure who the other club was, to work with their scrum. Because really the key factor is that we all are highly competitive. And if Pete can add to our abilities and he can add to the abilities of some of the other clubs, I think that's a benefit for everybody. So Pete's going to be part of it. We also have Luke Gross, who's our director of amateur rugby. And he, of course, had 12 years professional rugby overseas and plenty of caps for the USA, and he's quite knowledgeable. He's under 20s coach Dave Sinnott. He during this fall he did skill work with our players, so he does some of the skill coaching. So we don't have, in effect, our full-time staff, if you will, is Dave Williams and Ciaran Browner being the backs and forwards coach. But then we utilize other coaches for their unique abilities. So Pete Borlas is, a great scrum coach. Luke Gross is great at lineouts. Dave Sinnott is a great skills coach and is got a real good eye for what athletes are doing. So we utilize as much coaching talent as we can.
Yeah, so it sounds like, because I look at this, like I said, I'm from a football background. My coaching staff in high school had 9 coaches. I had an offensive line coach for when I played offensive line, and then I had a linebacker coach for when I played linebackers, like 2 different skill sets. Over time, how do you see the evolution of your staff? More position coaches, although it looks like right now you've got 5 guys, which is actually more than what I thought it was going to be, because I figured roles were actually delineated, like you said. Luke Gross is, taking over your amateur program, and then Dave Sinnott is your U20 team, U20 guy. So I figured they were just not going to be involved, but this makes a lot more sense.
Yeah, I think if you look at a rugby training session, you don't necessarily need all of those coaches there at all times. And so you have the opportunity to bring somebody in who might be a specialist, and they come in on a regular basis to work on the specific skill set that's needed for that particular thing. So it really depends on how you organize. And some of that depends on your resources. You also have to worry about people stepping on each other's feet, or you have to worry about, like often happens in you watch some amateur teams who have a number of coaches, and there's one coach coaching and the other 3 coaches are BSing next to each other. So they're shooting the breeze. And what they should be doing, from my experience from coaching football, is they should be coaching the athletes, everything that they're doing. So as the offensive line is walking back, if you're doing football, as they're walking back from the play, their coach is talking to the tackles and guards about what they did on their block, or there's somebody talking to the tight end, et cetera. Rugby's not quite set up that way. And maybe it shouldn't be set up the way. I will say one thing, though. This does set us apart from some of the other teams, is my experience in high school football coach for 20 years is that the successful teams year in and year out are programs that have a coaching staff that's been together for a lot of years. So when I was at Liberty High School, our whole staff basically went to Kentwood High School. So we coached together and we played in the state championship games and playoffs every year. I think part of that was because we all worked together. We knew what we were doing. Glendale's coaching staff basically has been together. Dave's been here since 2008. Ciaran Browner's been here since 2005 when I started, or 2006 when we started our program. So our coaches have been here for a long time. And so we have a pretty good operating procedure about how we go about doing things. And I think that helps for our success.
So you've talked a bit about coach training and development in our last conversation, and then you've mentioned that you guys are going to England next week. So what is it that Glendale does to stay on at the top?
Well, I think for all of the coaches in Major League Rugby, I think one of the things you have to do is you have to be a student of the game. And you have to work at being on top of things that are new, that are going on. And in the United States, we tend to be, we're real spread out. And as coaches, we tend to be isolated and separated. So you don't necessarily have people to bounce things off of. Now there's blogs and so forth to do that. But it's different when you're, sitting in the room together and you're having conversation. So I think one of the key things is that you do your research, or you have opportunities, in this case, for our staff to go to England and get together with some of the clubs that we're involved with there, so that we can see what is the newest trends or the things that are going on. And then, of course, you obviously are going to find different things that people are doing, but, in terms of, say, skills and drills, but a lot of those things you can make up yourself. What you really want to do is be on top of the game as it changes so that you're not left behind. So that's really a big part of it. And we encourage our coaches to do that. One of those things is making sure that you're getting certified, or you try to get certified at the highest level that you can. Or if we have an opportunity to go to IRANS in New Zealand, take that opportunity if we, have the financial resources to do it and the time. Yeah.
So one of the things when I spoke with Matt Truville is that they're doing local, as part of their academy program, they're doing a local coach training and ed. Will that be a future part of your academy?
Well, I'm not sure what you mean by local coach training. What we do is for local high school coaches, we invite them in. So when Francois Lowe was here with part of the Bath organization, Bath Rugby, he did a session on the breakdown. And so we invite all the local high school coaches to come in and be part of that. And so they have that opportunity to see, again, how the professionals doing it. And so they have that opportunity. We do classroom session on our attack and how we attack, and why it would be fairly simple for the school coaches. If they wanted to incorporate that in their program, they could. So we do classroom session, then they come down and watch the professional team practice what we just did. And then they meet with Dave and Ciaran and have those conversations. So that's one aspect that we do. A second aspect that we have this spring, because we'll be practicing, the boys high school will be practicing. Our players will be assigned to different high school teams if those teams would like our players to be there. And then those players will come in once a week and provide some coaching in their area of expertise. That allows us to make those connections with the schools and allows our players to have to coach, which makes them have to think about the job that they actually do. So those are some of the things that we're doing. We've also recently had conversations with Colorado State University about the possibility of setting up some type of an agreement between the two of us, so that we're working together. And part of that would be, again, working on coordinating our coaching so that our professional coaches can provide, I guess you could say, coach training, for their coaches and players.
Well, I think you hit that ball out and definitely got the answer I was looking for. So,
well, I wasn't looking to give you an answer. I'm just telling you what we're doing.
Well, it was kind of funny. It's I'm not sure what you're really asking, And well, if that question was worded wrong, you definitely answered the intent of my question. And I got exactly what I wanted to know, which was yes.
Great.
But that's pretty awesome that you guys are pushing resources down to the local high school coaches, because what that does is, it increases, their level of knowledge, but it also increases the coaching skills that their players will receive, so that they're, better developed for either when they go to college or if they walk down to Glendale and enroll in the academy and try to compete for a spot.
Exactly. And I think it makes those connections with the rugby community too, which is an important aspect of what we're doing with Major League Rugby.
Let's see. So before pro was a thing, Glendale attempted to be a part of what I think was called NAPR, which is North American Professional Rugby. That effort didn't meet your guys and your partner's conditions to launch. How is MLR different? Because it looks like it's going.
Actually, that's a great question. One of the things with the previous attempt was, and in the previous attempt, you basically, everything that we have kind of set out, and kind of a lot of the format of where we are now was part of that original conversation and so forth. The biggest difference is you have to make a financial commitment and be willing to commit. And I think in the original attempt, not everybody was willing to put in their dollars. There were a couple of teams, but you need a critical mass, and we didn't have a critical mass. And with the group that we have now, we had the teams that have been announced, but in addition to that, we have teams that have not been announced, that were part of the initial discussions and so forth. But when it really comes down to it, the club or the organization has to make a physical and financial commitment to the league. And that's a risk. And some people really weren't at that time ready to make that risk. They might be ready to make the risk in 2019. So the teams that are part of the Major League Rugby for the spring of 2018, all have made a significant financial risk. And that's why it's so important that we keep our expenses under control and that we do the best job we can so that we come back in 2019 with these other teams that want to join.
Got it. Let's see. As a director of rugby, one of the traditional things is to coach coaches. How do you coach your coaches?
Well, really, I think coaching coaches first is about observing them as they're coaching. So that could be a practices and can be a game. So you observe what they're doing, and then based on that, you have the ability to then meet and have a discussion about that. Now, a discussion really, from my viewpoint, should be a discussion that is a questioning discussion. So you really are, from my standpoint, I want to ask questions that other coach then can respond to. And some of those questions, because they already know the answers, they just might not have thought about it. So as an example, you might have a situation where you have a group of players who are really strong kind of leaders, but they're all going in different directions. And I had a coach that he recognized that was happening, but then he didn't address it. And so for me, then I have the opportunity to ask questions like, well, what did you do? How did you handle that? And so forth. And then that coach has the opportunity to respond, because they undoubtedly have the answer. Okay. I don't want to give them an answer because they already know the answer. They just have to find it. And so that's part of that, I think, coaching development, because if they figure it out, then it's their ownership. It's theirs, not mine. If I tell them, oh, you need to do this, that doesn't, that's not what players need to know either. It's like you go catch the ball. Well, the player knows to catch the ball. the question is, well, what are you doing with your eyes? Where are your hands? Those kind of things. Yeah.
Then there was a question about the Glendale combine that was pushed back. When will that be rescheduled to? And will that canvas just for more talent to come into your amateur program, or also to feed into the Raptors?
What was the first part of the question?
So you guys had a
combine.
Advertising.
You're talking about the combine.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, actually, we had scheduled the combine, and we didn't have quite honest, we didn't have a really good response. And I think we probably didn't have a good response because we already have our team. We're in a different situation than Houston or Austin or Utah in particular, probably New Orleans, is that, Houston is starting from scratch. Utah is starting from scratch for the most part. Austin Elite is not really starting from scratch, but they're sort of starting from scratch because they broke apart from the Huns. So I think their needs are probably different than our needs. We already have a squad set out. And so some of that would be, if we're bringing players in, we already know who we have. If we find players or find people that we want to bring in, we would probably direct them to our D1 team, because it's not likely someone's going to come in and you're going to go, wow, you're going to move right into the pro team. Particularly like you were saying earlier. So let's say it's a crossover athlete comes in and you go, wow, this is a great athlete, but they don't know a lot about rugby. So they've got to get their rugby skills somewhere. And then for us, that'd probably be their D1 team, where they can upskill depending on their age. Could be your academy team. And then they move in and they prove that they can play on the professional team.
Got it. All right. Let's see here. I think that about wraps it up for me, Mark. Thank you for your time today. And, hope to talk to you again, especially as the season kicks off in April. And, can't wait to talk to Dave eventually, and then some of your players going forward.
Looking forward to it. Thanks, Aaron. I appreciate taking the time to talk with you and you having that interest in Major League Rugby, because we all are excited about the direction we're going, and we want to see us come back in 2019.
Definitely. I really am very hopeful with all the stuff that I've been shown by the league and all the stuff that all of the teams have shown to, just what's about to happen. And it's something special that I just really want it to stick, because if it sticks, everyone talks about how we're the sleeping dragon or the sleeping giant.
Mm-hmm.
If it sticks, then there's something to move towards.
Yep, absolutely.
So, that wraps it up for this episode of Earful of Dirt Lineouts. The show is back this next Monday, 10 p.m. Eastern, 7 p.m. Pacific time.